When we open up the gospel today, and today we're celebrating the baptism of the Lord, it necessarily brings up some questions about what baptism is, what the role of sin and redemption is in Jesus' life, and consequently in our own lives. Oftentimes for us, when we think of baptism, we think of sin. We think maybe that concept of original sin, or we think of kind of the continual call back to our baptism and to cleanse ourselves from sin. And so when we see Jesus come for baptism, it's a little confusing, right? Why did Jesus come for that? And we often hear this statement when we talk about Jesus' humanity, that Jesus was like us in all things but sin. I've always found that statement a little frustrating because growing up, and I think particularly for those of us, I think that grew up Catholic, sin is a big part of what it means to be human. Temptation is always lurking around every corner, and somehow you are both supposed to not sin, but you are also repeatedly reminded that you did sin. And if you were a particularly neurotic perfectionist child like me, you were always concerned, had I committed a venial sin or a mortal sin? Where was I going in that given moment? And hell always felt like one little misstep away. And if sin is such a significant part of our lives and our theology, something that we're born into, it seemed to me that Jesus was missing out on a pretty big part of what it meant to be human. Somehow, in even recognizing his humanity, it seemed like he was still just like a little bit more divine, right? Like not quite the same kind of human that I am. And it feels like we're a little separate from him, a little different. Today, as we celebrate the baptism of the Lord, liturgically we're marking this pivoting point. We're closing out Christmas. We're going to shift briefly into ordinary time, and then we're going to jump into Lent. And it's kind of like the last 7 days, like the church pressed the fast forward button on Jesus' life. Just last week, the 3 wise men were meeting him in the manger, and now we've skipped ahead to about 30 years, and Jesus is getting ready for his ministry. So we're here. No worries, whatever happened those first 30 years. And so we're kind of just in this kind of little odd period of time where we're just before we go into Lent. And Lent, as most of you know, it seems to come up on us very quickly, right? Like we just celebrate Christmas, and all of a sudden we're going to be in Lent. And of course, Lent and that time, we focus even more so, or we feel like it, on like sinfulness and kind of our wrongdoings as humans. And so we meet Jesus right before, in the order of the gospel, not necessarily the order of how we're going to read the readings in the church, but in the order of the gospel, he goes and he's tempted after he's baptized. And so this baptism that he's participating in, and all these folks are participating in, it was a very common Jewish practice of cleansing. And it's what we would eventually call baptism. But this ritual of cleansing from wrongdoing and renewal was a very common practice for the Jewish community, and very common in many religious traditions. But for the Jewish community, it wasn't just a one-time event and kind of how we have seen baptism in our theology. This was a repeated thing, to be cleansed, to begin anew, to become pure, to perform certain rituals. And so that's where we meet Jesus in this moment. So everyone's coming for that similar purpose of cleansing and renewal and beginning again. And so it must have been unsettling, to say the least, for John the Baptist to meet Jesus in this moment, as he knew within himself, John the Baptist, that he was the prophet that was prophesizing Jesus coming into the world. And here he is meeting him, and Jesus asking to be baptized by him. And if Jesus is like us in all things but sin, why would he come to John the Baptist that day? This week I found myself thinking about sin more than I like to. And as I thought about Jesus and this concept of him being like us in all things but sin, there are some things that we still know that Jesus understood and felt that are what sin is wrapped up in. We know that Jesus experienced temptation. We know that in the following scriptures, and I would imagine in those 30 years leading up to this point, he probably experienced temptation in his life too. And then we also know from all of our scriptures that Jesus was a deeply compassionate and connected human being. So I imagine when Jesus was with this crowd of people going to be cleansed, as he brushed up against them, as he heard pieces of their conversation, he knew what they felt. He knew some of those after effects of sin, right? The grief, the guilt, the frustration that I've done this thing over again, usually actually like the sin, whatever it is that we participate in, that's usually not that bad. It's usually the after that we don't like, right? And I imagine he knew that compassionately in his heart. He knew the pain that these people were walking with. And I imagine as he saw them with the water pouring over them, he saw that return of hope, that return of I am starting again, that belief and hope within themselves. Like Jesus saw that and felt that too. And so I think, yes, on the one hand, he didn't experience sin, but he knew all the emotions and the feelings that come with experiencing sin and experiencing that renewal. The theologian John Kavanaugh wrote that we actually really misunderstand that concept, that Jesus is like us in all things but sin, because we have understandably but wrongfully come to the conclusion that to be human is to sin. What he said is that if Jesus was truly human and truly divine, when he was walking with that crowd that day, he was not there to show them who he was as that he was God. Rather, he was there to show them what it meant to be human. He is human because he does not sin. And John Kavanaugh writes that all of our sin is nothing other than the rejection of the truth of our humanity. So think about that. What if sin is not integral to what it means to be human? That all of our focus on sin has really missed the point. Because when the heavens opened up when Jesus was baptized, we hear God call Jesus his own and his beloved. And what if that's the case for us too? What if that is our starting point? Not the starting point of sin, but the starting point that we are God's own and we are God's beloved. And of course, that doesn't mean that we're not going to fall short of our call. We're going to succumb to anger and our passions and our desires. But the point is to understand that all of those missteps that we make, those tend to be the human love part of us that's got misguided, right? When we act out in anger, usually it's because that piece of our humanity has felt hurt or attacked. When we go to that temptation in our lives, we go to it because we're probably overwhelmed and we have the sense that we need to maybe numb ourselves a little. And that's because that love piece of us is struggling. And as humans, we just get stuck in that a little bit. But it's not that in the depth of us that it's sin. The depth of us is love. And it just gets misguided sometimes as we try to hold that love and live into that love. I imagine that when we come to God, when we seek that renewal, it's not as if God is up in the sky keeping a scorecard of like, oh, Corein did that again. Rather, God, I think, is much more like a mother who's just watched her child throw herself on the floor and scream out in a tantrum and says, oh, come here, sweetie, let me give you a hug. I think that's much more closer to how God knows us and interacts with us in our shortcomings. Because to be human does not mean that sin or death is gone, but in Jesus' entering into that very intimate part of our lives, he has existentially changed what sin and death are. They no longer have the power that they have. To sin is not the end. To die is not the end. Because to be human means that we are beloved and that we will forever and always live in the life of God. And so it is in that knowledge that allowed Jesus to boldly live a life of risk, of generosity and healing, because he knew who he was. He knew even in the temptations that he faced that God loved him deeply. And so it is the same for us. In whatever struggles we're facing today or in the day ahead, God is just with us and just loving us through it. And if we can keep centering ourselves back into that for healing for ourselves and also in that way, then we can reach out to others and be a healing, loving voice for them too.